ตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนามัสสามิ Good evening, everybody. When we recollect the Buddha, usually we're recollecting three main qualities: the wisdom of the Buddha, the compassion of the Buddha, and the purity of mind of the Buddha. Particularly the compassion of the Buddha is very important because it's this quality of compassion that maintained the Buddha in his quest as a bodhisattva, being who's aspired to become a Buddha. Our Buddha, Siddhartha Buddha, began that quest, they say, when he was a hermit called Sumedha, and being so inspired by the Buddha Dipankara, he made his aspiration by placing himself across a muddy puddle when the Buddha had come into town and inviting him to step on his back so that the Buddha wouldn't get wet. And as as the Buddha stepped on his back, he made this resolve, solemn resolve in his mind to become a Buddha, just like Dipankara the Buddha. And Dipankara acknowledged it and said, one day this hermit will become a Buddha called Siddhartha Gautama. And over many, many lifetimes, the Bodhisattva practiced to perfect his paramis, and compassion for all beings was pretty much the driving engine for that, all that effort and putting up with all the difficulties and obstacles. And then once in his final life as Siddhartha Gautama, once he became a Buddha, enlightened, fully awakened, again the compassion flowed from his heart, but combined with the wisdom and the purity of a mind that was completely free from greed, anger and delusion. And that compassion transformed into his teaching, or we say dispensation, teaching of the Dhamma Vinaya, teaching of what has now been called Buddhism over 45 years or so in India, putting up with physical hardship, mental hardship and difficulty in order to spread the teachings out of compassion for beings. So it's a tremendous driving force in our practice, compassion. And when we talk about the Brahma Vihara Dhammas, we've talked about metta last time. And metta is just this basic goodwill one develops for oneself and other beings, with that basic respect for life and valuing of life. All life is worth having a good thought for. We cultivate goodwill for all forms of life as a regular practice, as a starting point in our practice. But then as we go on in our life and our practice, there'll be some beings we meet who are suffering, or sometimes we are suffering and we know we're suffering, or someone we meet, they're suffering. So straight out of metta or goodwill emerges compassion, Karuna. So they're very interchangeable as both meditation objects and as just basic attitudes in daily life. One develops goodwill when that leads straight into compassion when the situation arises that compassion is called for. One wishes somebody well, but if you see them suffering, then your next thought would be, well, I hope they're free from suffering. So metta and karuna go hand in hand. But karuna is particularly that thought for yourself or others to be free from suffering. Or even if somebody is heading towards suffering, it's that wish to prevent them, to stop them. So one of my earliest memories of that, when I was 7 years old, I was coming home from school one day. I had to walk about 2 kilometers home from school, and quite often I would walk with a friend who was a bit more athletic than me, more sharp than me perhaps, and we had to cross a number of main roads, and we're crossing one main road just near my house, and I picked a lousy spot to cross the road on a corner, and it was a very busy road with cars driving quite fast up and down, and they would hurtle around the corner, and I hadn't seen the cars coming, and I was going to cross the road, and I stepped into the road, and my friend instinctively pulled on my hood of my anorak and pulled me back out of the road, and I was about to tell him off because I thought he was joking, but then I realized, oh, he just saved my life. Car was coming around the corner very fast and very close. It was so close I literally almost got run over, but my friend saved my life. And karuna is like that. Compassion is this quality that you're developing, say in a meditation like we've just done, as an attitude in your daily life, and you're just building on what seeds you have in your mind. You already will have some compassion there from the past, but now as a practice we're developing, we're nurturing it as an intention, the intention to be free from suffering. So in that situation, maybe it's just simply pulling someone out of the way of an oncoming car. Compassion to prevent suffering that you could see will happen, but if I can stop it in time, I can prevent it. So compassion is not just once somebody is sick or ill or stressed, it's also doing things to stop that from even happening in the first place. So a good example of that is the Buddha himself. Who did he have this sense of responsibility to still as a Buddha? Well, he still had his family, parents, wife, child. His child Rahula, quite a few of the teachings the Buddha gave in the first part of his life as a Buddha were to Rahula, his son, and he wanted to give his son the best tools for living the life of a human being skillfully, successfully, and to be free from suffering. So a number of the teachings he gave his son in the early days, one was teaching on metta, the value of developing kindness, compassion, mudita, upekkha. And also very often quoted, the teaching on karma, the importance on learning to reflect on action, intentional action, and the consequences of action in our life. Because this is where we learn particularly about how suffering arises from its causes, and so many of the causes are our own actions of body, speech and mind, uncontrolled, unmindful, unaware or unwise. We create suffering for ourselves and others all the time. But when we bring up the qualities of self-control, wise reflection, and direct it towards karma, then we can change that habit of harming ourselves, harming others, and bring up, say, goodwill, compassion, with the understanding of karma. So the Buddha taught his son this. He said to practice, reflecting on your actions before you do them, during, and then after, reflect again. Is this thing I'm going to do, or what I'm going to say, or even just what I'm thinking, is it for my benefit and the benefit for others, or is it for my harm or the harm of others? And this is a gift you can give to another person, whether it's your child or a friend or someone who's just interested in Buddhism, asking you what's the best thing you can get from Buddhism, how can Buddhism help you, or so on. It's a great gift to the world, the teaching on karma, as a starting point for the practice. Learning more and more what is good karma, what is bad karma, and then sharing that information, reminding yourself if you're the one who's deluded, or sharing that information with others for their benefit. And the practice of compassion often begins like this, just what is useful to give to others. So it may be just in your immediate life, your family, who if you're a parent or a brother or a sister, or you're the offspring, the child of your parents, the people you live with, what is one of the most valuable gifts you can give them is the Dhamma. So reminding each other to make good karma and to avoid making bad karma. That kind of intention comes from compassion, or can come from compassion, hopefully. Compassion in action is often seen as a kind of a gift to the world. It's that gift where compassion comes from understanding as well, and from wisdom, from understanding. So the more we practice, the more we understand what is really valuable and beneficial for us as human beings through our own efforts, our own practice. Then we start to see in the people around us what is beneficial and useful for them. So as we keep developing the practice, naturally through experience gained in time, through our efforts in the practice over time, we start to gain some understanding, and that is perhaps one of the greatest gifts we can give to others. Just encouraging others to reflect on the Dhamma, passing on the teachings, or giving opportunity for people to come in contact with the teachings is a great gift. And it's very much coming out of compassion. At this time, obviously the world is full of concerns, anxieties, fears, and frustrations based around the impact of coronavirus. So compassion meditation and developing the attitude of compassion I would say is an essential quality to develop in daily life, just to deal with the heightened levels of anxiety and tension in ourselves and then for others. And to develop compassion, we have to keep looking back at ourselves, coming to understand our own experience better. So it goes hand in hand with the practice of mindfulness and awareness and wise reflection. When we experience suffering, stop and ask yourself, where is this coming from? What is this experience of suffering? Because unfortunately, most of the time when we do experience suffering in one way or other, our habit is to just run away from it, rather than learn from it, rather than to investigate it and understand it better. We tend to run away from it. Sometimes we suppress it by pushing it down in our consciousness so we don't have to acknowledge it or have anything to do with it. If it's suffering other people, we tend to do the same. And we tend to turn away from somebody who's suffering often because we're not comfortable with them or with that experience, or even run away or try to change the subject. If we talk about things that make us feel awkward or somebody else is suffering, we change the subject, we move away. Often that's our first reaction towards suffering. But the Buddha encouraged us actually to learn, be a little bit more patient and braver, because that's where we can really improve our lives and the lives of other people, by understanding suffering better. So that's why to do a meditation on the development of compassion as a theme, the thought, may I be free from suffering, may others be free from suffering, on a regular basis is a very powerful thing, because you're developing just that basic attitude of how can I free myself or the people around me from suffering. And it becomes part of who you are, becomes part of the way you think, part of the way you view the world. But you have to develop this gently over time, because you'll encounter this obstacle that the mind doesn't want to see suffering or have anything to do with it. And so, maybe there's somebody we know who's suffering and we just feel, I can't talk to them, I can't be with them because of that reaction, that turning away from it. The quality of compassion, the word Karuna and the quality of compassion that the Buddha talked about, literally the word means like a movement of mind. The mind is being moved by the experience of suffering. Moved in a positive way, moved to do something about it, to end it, to find a way out of it. So the mind is moved whenever it encounters suffering. But sometimes that movement is so strong, the emotion is so overwhelming, we find we can't face it. So that's why we have to go gently and be very patient in the development of compassion. Sometimes it happens, say like, particularly you ask people at this time working in healthcare industry, hospitals, doctors, nurses, or anyone who's in some kind of service or assistance providing a job or situation. That movement of mind may be only quite small. Every time you encounter suffering in the people around you, so you work in a hospital or you care for an elderly person or disabled person, there may be just small moments where you're moved or affected emotionally by that person's suffering, and you won't really notice it that much. The movement is very small. You have small moments of compassion where you're realizing, oh, this person is suffering, that's not good, what can I do? One thing you notice over time is that maybe those small movements of compassion, being moved, feeling sad, feeling sorry, empathizing with someone, they can build up. They can build up until it reaches a point where your mind is really moved in a very serious way, and then you find you can't cope anymore, or at least temporarily you have to stop. This is one of the dangers of practicing compassion, whether it's as a meditation or just in daily life. Often we have our limits because it involves a small movement of the mind every time one is facing suffering and then wishing oneself or others to be overcome, free from suffering. There's a little trembling of the mind, movement of the mind. And so one has to be careful what one's limits are, what one's, the battery of one's mental battery, how much charge it has in it. Just like your phone, you have to be aware. If your phone is running low, you have to find a place where you can recharge it. Compassion is like that. We can easily run out of it because it drains our mind, drains our heart as we're confronting suffering. And this is one of the skills of developing compassion as a meditation or in daily life. You have to recognize where you're at. And sometimes it's not wrong to set aside certain tasks or jobs or duties we may have if we're becoming overwhelmed by them. So you need to take a rest. So if you're working in a hospital or something like that, or you're a school teacher, or you're helping someone who's terminally ill or something, whatever, you'll notice that sometimes compassion may be simply just preserving your own state of mind, and you need to take a break, take a rest if you can, in order to go back and meet with more suffering again. And this is because the mind gets moved by suffering, and it can be quite confronting or draining, challenging. But as you practice as a meditation and as a contemplation in daily life, what you're doing is you're getting stronger in the ability to cope with suffering, your own suffering and suffering of others. And as more awareness and wisdom and experience grows, one of the things you can see is that, well, suffering is a temporary experience. Often we don't see that at first because of our thinking, our negative thinking, or our tiredness, or our delusions. We often remember past suffering, and then it gets to the point where we keep remembering suffering over and over again, and we stick with that perception, we attach to that perception in our mind. So if it's a person who's suffering, if you only think of them as, they're suffering so much, I really can't face it today, or I can't be with them today. What you have to do is bring up mindfulness as that thought or that memory is coming up, and sometimes you have to investigate it and stop and ask yourself, is this really true? Because as you learn through the practice of meditation, particularly as you become more mindful, more aware, you'll recognize that suffering is not always, it's not a permanent state of affairs. It comes and goes as a feeling, as an experience. And even though unfortunately sometimes for some people it's a recurring experience, but there will be times and moments when you're maybe not suffering, or that person is not suffering, or there's parts of their life or your life that you can see are not suffering. And that's another part of the practice, is to learn how to focus on the non-suffering so that one can deal with the suffering and see that, well, suffering is a temporary state of mind. One can free oneself from suffering. Then there's a chance one gets motivated in the practice. Because when we do reach the end of our energy, the end of our tether, at that point we tend to get stuck in the view, suffering, I'm always suffering, or they're always suffering, it's just hopeless, there's no end to this. But what the Buddha kept reminding us is that there is an end to suffering, and often it's much closer than you think. Where does suffering end? Well, it usually suffering ends very close to where it begins. If you establish mindfulness when you're experiencing some suffering, for example, some pain in your leg when you're meditating, you would call that suffering. Bringing up the wisdom and the mindfulness to reflect on this pain, it arises, it passes away, it comes and goes, can give you some energy to practice compassion with yourself at that time, because you've seen maybe before, this pain is temporary, it's come, it's gone before. This time I can face it with compassion and go through it with patience, with compassion, because I know it's temporary. I've seen that before and I'm seeing it now maybe. It's like when you're in a situation that you think, I can't stand this anymore. So it could be an illness or some injury, or it could be just a life situation. You're in a difficult situation at work where you have some problems with other people, or you just got the burden, the pressure of work, targets and jobs that people have given you, and you've got this thought, I can't stand it anymore. If you're somebody who's practiced developing this thought of compassion mindfully before, one thing you can bring up at that point is that thought, but I've been here before, and I've maybe even had this thought before, but once the thought has come up in my mind and finished, what next? You get a moment of space and the thought has gone, the thought, I can't stand this, or I can't take this anymore. It's just a thought. And what do thoughts do? They arise, they pass away. And what do you do after it's passed away? You carry on. Many, many times, particularly meditators will have understood this point. That is where compassion arises. And you have understanding, you empathize with yourself, or it may be somebody else, but you also know suffering is a temporary experience. It arises, it passes away, it changes. And maybe the most compassionate thing at that moment is just to remind yourself to be patient, to watch, to observe, and allow something to arise and pass away. It could be a feeling, a train of negative thinking, whatever. And then you can bring that up for others as well, because what we learn for ourselves, we can pass on to others. And we do that. So if you think about your own life, when you've experienced the compassion of others, it's probably, first of all, is your parents, isn't it? Over and over again when you're young, they remind you things, don't they? Say, don't worry, it will pass. You run along, you fall over and you graze your knee. They say, never mind, it will get better. They rub you down, they help you, and they say, never mind, it will pass, it will heal. That's based on that kind of insight and understanding. It's coming from compassion, and then the understanding of suffering arises, passes away. It's not a permanent thing. We receive that from our parents first. the help when we make mistakes, when we fall. They help us up, and they help give us support when we need it. Over and over again, to the point often when we take it for granted or we even forget it. We often remember moments when other people have shown us compassion, but often our parents have shown us infinite compassion when we were kids, and we got so used to it, we just don't think of it anymore. But now, maybe as a mindfulness practice, sometimes it's good just to sit down and run back through your life moments when you've received compassion, just as a way to get yourself familiar with it. Your parents, how did they show you compassion? Tolerated you? When you were young, it was maybe just tolerating your uncontrollability and all your problems. Learning to walk, learning to eat, learning to come and go and do things. As you become older, it's more you tolerate your words and maintain compassion and empathize when you're a teenager and you're confused and expressing your moods and emotions not very well, not very skillfully. Our parents usually, compassion changes with our growing at our age, but they've shown it over and over again. That may be something you can think back to and understand better what the feeling of compassion is, what the thought and compassion in action, what it's like. And then apply it in your life, but then spreading out, not only with your family, close family, but then out into society, particularly with the people around you that you meet. So the nature of compassion, it's very close to wisdom. It's this understanding that all beings want to be happy, want to be free from suffering, and it's that wish, that intention, that resolve of mind, putting that into action. And that's something we practice, just like goodwill, metta. Compassion is something you have to keep practicing over and over again, making it stronger, just like as our parents did with us over and over again. But then maybe also developing it for yourself as you're going through life, especially if you have a tendency towards negativity, depression, or maybe people around you, particularly when suffering comes up for them. So it becomes something like a tool that you have ready, whether it's you who need it, something comes up in your life, or whether it's somebody else out of the blue, their life, they run into some trouble of some sort. You have it ready there because you've practiced it and you're familiar with it. It's not an unfamiliar emotion, it's not an unfamiliar thought, it's the opposite. It's something familiar to you. You're used to it because you've been developing it regularly. This is exactly how all the enlightened teachers have practiced through their lives, developing their compassion so it becomes something very strong, very much a part of them. And of course it's tested all the time, and sometimes you lose it. What is the opposite of compassion? Well, it's particularly hatred, cruelty, seeking revenge. So of course everybody in their life, whether it's the Buddha or us or anyone else, will have been tested over and over again. It's part of living in the world with other people. There'll be times when your compassion is tested and somebody is cruel to you and hurts your feelings, or physically hurts you in some way, or takes advantage of you in some way. You'll want to get them back. Someone bullies you, you want to get them back. These are the times when you have to, your compassion is tested and you have to work hard to bring it up. So just like the Buddha teaching his son Rahula, teaching to reflect on karma, we reflect on the karma of holding on to grudges, holding on to the thought of cruelty, and how toxic that is for our own mind. Even if someone has hurt you, genuinely hurt you, they genuinely have done something bad or wrong to you, learning to reflect back on your own state of mind as if you can't forgive them and let go of that anger and hatred towards that person, your mind is poisoned constantly, isn't it? And you'll keep remembering, keep thinking about it. So a big part of the practice of compassion is the practice of forgiveness, learning to forgive. And sometimes people think, oh, this is just a weakness of Buddhists, a weakness of meditators. If every time somebody bullies you or hurts you, you just forgive them, then you're becoming a kind of weak person and letting people run all over you. But compassion doesn't work like that. It doesn't mean to say you can't do things to protect yourself or right a wrong or even teach that person a lesson in the proper way. It doesn't mean to say you're inactive or passive, but it's a specific practice you're doing. It's a specific task for a specific problem. So if you have been hurt by someone and you experience anger, and particularly the thought to get them back, seek revenge, you're becoming more aware of how that is hurting yourself, that thought. It's leaving an impression on your mind. It may keep reoccurring over and over again. And it's like an illness of mind. Just as an illness of body, if it's left unaddressed, it will keep reoccurring, get worse, and maybe in the end it may kill you. In the same way, hatred, revenge is gradually killing your mind, killing the happiness of your mind, and you become bitter, you become resentful to the world, and often it spreads from one isolated incident, it starts to spread to other parts of your life, and the way you look at the world you can easily become depressed. You can also, in the worst instance, do very unskillful things, following through on your hatred or your revenge. So compassion is very much the antidote to that, and it's particularly rooted in this giving of forgiveness, another kind of dana that we do. So dana, generosity, and compassion, very closely linked. The way the Buddha described it, the giving of forgiveness is really the giving of safety. When you practice compassion, it doesn't mean you are stupid or passive or not aware of things. But what you're saying is, ultimately, the most valuable thing is to practice self-control, self-awareness, and not give in to the more unskillful mental states that come up. They may be prompted by other people's behavior, but not giving in to the desire to hit back, fight back, get back through body, speech, or mind. You're taking that as a priority. And it's going to have a good result because, in the long run, if you're giving up the desire to hurt others, defeat others, get back at others, well, you're reducing the possibility and the causes for others to hurt you. So it's in your own interest. But in the short term, part of our mind will say, oh, but they behave so badly, they deserve what they get. And you may want to inflict some pain on them or something. But in the long run, it's better to give that up, give up that thought and forgive and provide safety for them in that sense by not wishing to hurt them. On the more subtle way, as compassion develops, it may be simply just empathizing with somebody, even somebody who's hurt you or you don't like, when they're suffering, recognizing when they're suffering, this is suffering. They don't want to be suffering, they want to be happy. So it's not simply giving up the desire to seek revenge on them, but maybe that's just the thought, the enjoyment in that person's suffering. Which is tempting, isn't it? When people we don't like or we feel have done wrongs to ourselves or to other people, there's that subtle enjoyment. I wish, I hope they're suffering. They deserve it. It's appropriate that they're suffering now. But it's recognizing that subtle sense of self that comes in at that point and saying, this is not good for me, not good for them. It's not going in the right direction, this way of thinking. So even learning to let go of that subtle enjoyment in the suffering of others. When I was young, I was brought up in the UK. You might call it a national disease. That people often are not so happy in themselves, and when they see people who maybe have gone ahead in life or in the news or somehow have been successful, but then falling on hard times, often it's a sort of a thing that people talk about, isn't it? Oh, Look at them, they thought they were so good, now look at them, they're suffering. But when you're practicing the development of compassion as a Brahma Vihara, as a meditation and as a wholesome object of mind, you're rejecting that way of thinking. You're saying, no, this is still harming myself and harming them, even if it's just a subtle thought, the subtle thought to enjoy the failure or the hurt that other people are experiencing. What we're aiming for is a state of mind where our compassion is balanced and continuous and unconditional and boundless and limitless. So on all these different levels, where it's just the level to get someone back or hurt them, or the level of just subtly enjoying the failure or the problems someone else is experiencing. As we develop compassion, you're kind of cleansing your mind of all these different levels or layers of cruelty, hatred that may be embedded in you for many years. This is not a practice that will necessarily yield its result overnight. It's something you have to keep working at, stripping away the layers of self that form around hatred, cruelty, revenge, and replacing them gradually with thoughts of empathy, compassion, sensitivity to others. It's a practice of replacement, really. Why? Because when we practice compassion, it makes us happy and it brings good for the world, because it's good for other people when we practice compassion. That's again why we go back and reflect on times in the past when we've maybe received the fruits of other people's compassion. Teachers, whether during our younger years at school or college, spiritual teachers, our parents, good friends, wise friends. This is a practice in itself, remembering or recollecting the good others have done for us, the advice we've received, the help, material help and support, the emotional support and love we receive from others. This can be a very uplifting meditation to do, and it's part of the meditation on compassion, both recollecting the compassion oneself as practice, but then the fruits of other people's compassion. Often we do tend to think of compassion as something that we receive from elders or people, like teachers or parents and so on, but it's not necessarily like that. It can come from any direction, and if you open your mind, you'll realize there's a lot of compassion in this world being passed around from young to old, old to young, male to female, female to male, in all kinds of walks of life. And it's quite an enjoyable part of the meditation, is to recollect acts of compassion that you've seen others performing to each other, or you've received, or that you've done for others. For me, as a monk, endless memories, good memories of people who have helped me personally as a monk, or seeing people doing good, helping other monks, or just helping each other in monasteries, because it's a place that's very good at nurturing compassion. So like one of the things I remember when I've been a monk about a year, and I was helping at a monastery that was an island in a reservoir. It's a place I sometimes talk about because I spent a few years there on and off when I was a junior monk. But I'd been a monk not for very long, just for a few months, and I, without realizing it, I got cellulitis in my legs, and one of my legs, and my leg gradually swelled up, became very painful to the point where I couldn't walk, which was quite a problem because I was staying in this monastery where it was right in a deep forest. There was just a couple of monks and a novice living there, a very small community, and we had no resources. There's no electricity, no kitchen, no lay people living there because we were living on an island. And it was about half an hour's walk, so about 1.5 kilometers from the main area, the central area, down to where there was a boat landing because we were on an island, and then there were a number of boats there. There was one power boat and one rowboat, and it was a half an hour row to get to the other side, or half an hour to go a bit further in the power boat to a further village along the shore. And then we could go on alms round every day for a few hours and then come back in the boat. So alms round, including the boat trip and the walk, was about 3 hours every day. Very hot, very tiring. And then I got this bad leg. I got cellulitis, so I had to stop walking. So it meant the other monks had to go on alms round for me and bring me back food and come and care for me, because I couldn't walk anywhere. I couldn't put weight on my foot at all. I could only crawl. So they had to put a urine potty, a spittoon in the corner of my kuti. They brought me my food. They brought me a bucket of water to bathe because I couldn't move anywhere, and there was no conveniences in those days. So most of that task fell to just one young monk and one young novice. The novice was only 16, but they looked after me very well with great compassion, great care. So I always remember that as a very good example of what compassion is, because those two, the Thai novice, Thai monk, they didn't know me very well. They'd only just met me. They were completely unrelated to me, but out of the goodness of their heart, they had to look after me and spend quite a few hours every day doing that. And they tried their best to make herbal remedies for my cellulitis, which failed, unfortunately. So it was getting worse, and gradually it became septic and pussy, and I got this very deep pussy wound that went right through to the bone. So the pain was getting worse, the state of my leg was getting worse, smelling, and eventually we thought we've got to try and get some medical help. And the only way to get that was to get rowed across the lake to the road where we could maybe arrange some kind of transport to go and see a doctor. So it's quite an involved and difficult situation. But the novice monk volunteered to push me in a push cart from where I was staying in the forest, 1.5 kilometers down to a jetty, row me across the lake. I did try and row a bit myself. I could do a little bit because I could use my arms, but it wasn't very convenient because you can't put weight on the leg. So he'd row me single-handedly across the lake. Then we managed to get in touch with the nearest doctor who would drive in a car to come and meet us, pick us up, take us to his clinic where he could treat my leg. And the first day he had a look at my leg and he said, "Wow, good thing you came. If you left it any longer, you'd lose your leg." And he had to do emergency kind of surgery to scrape away and remove some nasty flesh, pussy flesh, which produced screams in me for a little while because it was very painful. And the little novice who was my assistant, very compassionate, taking me every day, pushing me on this cart 3 kilometers a day, rowing me several kilometers in this boat every day, and just generally looking after me. He took the opportunity to very compassionately tell me, Ajahn, well, I wasn't an Ajahn then, he just called me Venerable. Venerable, your meditation's no good. You screamed. And I said, "Why are you saying that? It's hurting." He said, "I'm saying it out of compassion because I'm reminding you got to be mindful when you experience pain." So a very good lesson in compassion in action, being taught by a 16-year-old to be more mindful as my leg was being gouged by a scalpel without anaesthetic. So anyway, that went on every day for a month. Luckily the leg improved, so it wasn't quite so painful every day, but the same procedure went every day. And that novice, every day he pushed me down the hill to the water, rowed me across, looked after me, brought me back, pushed me uphill, which was quite a long, hard trip for him. That was compassion in action. So even though he was 16 and he could be quite mischievous and quite naughty and outspoken, I never got angry with him. I always forgave him, even though he was quite annoying sometimes, because it was so obvious he was being compassionate. Compassion is like that. It breeds compassion in your own mind and in others around you if you're willing to put compassion into action, put it to the test. The other thing I remember from that situation was that one day he was pushing me downhill to go down to the boat jetty. It was downhill. And he used to like to push fast. He's 16 years old, and there's a push cart, and I'm just lying there because I'm totally immobile. So he liked to run a bit because he'd gather speed as he's going downhill, and there's no brake on this push cart. So it's basically pot luck how we finished at the bottom of the hill where the water was. I never once went in the water, but we had a few hard stops when he hit rocks. But anyway, we're going through the forest very fast one day. As he's running down the hill, he would be chuckling, enjoying himself, having a bit of a game. I'll be sitting there bumping around, a lot of pain, but putting up with it. And then suddenly he veered off the track. It was just a little narrow, muddy track in the forest. He veered off to the left really hard, really fast, and crashed into a tree. And, it was painful. It wasn't seriously painful, but it wasn't very pleasant. So we both ended up on the ground, and I was just about to scold him, lose my temper. And he said, no, don't. I did it for a good reason. And he pointed, and there was a huge cobra in the middle of the track, because I hadn't seen him. I would travel with my face to him, pushing the car, and my back to the pathway ahead, so I hadn't seen it. Whereas this huge cobra had come up and was about to get us, so he diverted off the track into the forest, crashed, but he saved me from the cobra, saved himself. So I just said, very compassionate of you, thank you very much. So compassion, it can even be quite painful sometimes, can't it? You have to tell somebody that something they don't want to hear, or you have to teach them a lesson they don't want. Sometimes it can be rough. The important thing is to maintain the intention, though. The intention is to avoid suffering or to somehow reduce the suffering that has arisen. So compassion is always practiced in conjunction with wisdom, and whether it's in a meditation, developing states of jhana, states of samadhi to all beings, or just in the more normal way, developing empathy and trying to do your best for the people around you, yourself and others, to reduce suffering or avoid suffering. It takes on many forms. So hand in hand with compassion and wisdom, one becomes quite creative, looking and learning to understand better what is suffering. And the best way to understand what suffering is and what to do about it is from your own experience. So if you put it into practice, you contemplate it, you develop it as a mental state regularly, over and over again, you get more skilled at it. You start to understand what is true compassion. And those who are best at it, well, those, what we call the Arya Pugalas, the noble ones. The compassion of the noble ones is reliable, it's true, because it's based on real understanding of what is suffering and what is the way out of suffering. They really see that clearly. They understand the Eightfold Noble Path, they've put it into practice. So the best place to get examples of compassion is from the noble ones, the enlightened ones, whether it's from the Buddha and the disciples in the time of the Buddha, or teachers you meet in this day and age. Teachers like Luang Por Chah, who literally used every last drop of his energy, physical and mental energy, to help others. He practiced for himself and fully understood this Buddhist path, and then he spent day after day, night after night, teaching people and sharing what he understood. That is the greatest compassion, the greatest gift, the gift of Dhamma. But we shouldn't overlook our own Dhamma. We all, as practitioners, have some Dhamma already in our minds. We already have some good qualities there. And the practice of compassion is nurturing them so they become strong, so that we become clearer in what is the Dhamma, what is the path to the end of suffering, and what is not. What is the path that's leading to more suffering? What ways and means lead to more problems for ourselves, more problems for other people? The more we see that clearly, the more we will act wisely and abandon the way that leads to more suffering and develop the way that leads out of suffering. And that's the most compassionate thing we can do for ourselves. You follow the Eightfold Path to completion. The most compassionate thing we can encourage others to do is follow the Eightfold Path to completion. So this is what teachers like Luang Por Chah would do. Most people, when they're beginning their practice of Buddhism, they go to a monk, they want compassion from the monk, they want understanding, they want sympathy, but what they want most of all is blessings. They want things from the monk. They want a blessing. They want holy water, they want medallions, they want ceremonies and rituals and chanting done. That's what we first go for when we go to the monk, maybe. But the true compassion of the monk, which Ajahn Chah showed over and over again, is to draw people towards the real Dhamma so that they can understand for themselves cause and effect, and so they can actually change their lives, abandon the unskillful causes that are behind their suffering, and develop the skillful causes that bring more happiness. That's why we're comparing the practice of compassion like a river. That's what we're aiming for, is to keep developing compassion over and over again, keep developing understanding to the point where it's like a river, it's flowing. And someone like Ajahn Chah was like that, it's flowing, his compassion is flowing. But how it manifested with different people would always vary because their particular problems and issues were different. But he was always getting them to listen to the Dhamma, because that's sometimes the thing we don't want, isn't it? We're not that compassionate to ourselves. We run away when it's time to listen to the Dhamma, practice the Dhamma. We want the blessing, but once we got the blessing, off we go. So Ajahn Chah would joke about this. He'd say, they want the blessing, but you give them a Dhamma talk and they get up straight away, or they start wriggling and looking around. I don't want a Dhamma talk. But actually the most compassionate thing a person can give you is the Dhamma. Remind you what you have to do, remind you what you should not do, remind you of the path. So the more we practice and understand for ourselves, the more we can empathize with others and see what we can share with them, whether it's just material help or spiritual help, give them some words of wisdom or some kindness, some support in one way or another. Or if that's what we need, that's also something we can provide for ourselves. Sometimes we have to make ourselves the priority. If we're really suffering, we're maybe not in a situation where we can help other people. We have to make ourselves a priority, and that's not necessarily wrong. So compassion is flexible like this. It's creative, it's flexible. It sees with wisdom what needs to be done and what's the best way to do it. So maybe for tonight, I've given you a few ideas about the practice of compassion, whether it's as meditation or compassion in daily life. So I'll leave you with these reflections and end the talk here.
And